It was a time in the United States when all things seemed possible. The nation had begun to heal from the wounds of the Civil War. Business was booming, and the country's unflinching expansion west was fueled by a self-righteous, manifest destiny. Life in the 1800s was good, especially on the railroads. Tracks were being laid across the continent at a feverish rate. And thundering locomotives steamed through the countryside, connecting small towns with big cities. When opportunity knocked in America, it was usually delivered by train.
For little kids growing up, there wasn't anything more exciting than seeing those locomotives pull into town, big long trains. And what those locomotives pulled was all your communications, your newspapers, your packages, your mail, the food in your stores. It was the lifeline of every small town around America.
As the nation grew, so did the drive of railroad owners to beat the competition. Locomotives pulled more cars in an effort to maximize profits. New safety features freed trains to go faster, grow heavier, and stretch out longer. Passengers could travel with greater speed and security, and more goods could reach markets sooner. But heavier trains strained the limits of the conventional steam engine. Crews could only coax so much power from the boiler before it could no longer handle the task. At first, the answer was to add more locomotives. It was not uncommon to have 2 or 3 steam engines pulling in unison. But each engine required a crew, and railroads didn't want to have to pay for the extra manpower to run one train. The solution, it seemed, was to build a locomotive so powerful that it could pull any train anywhere. The rush was on to build the giants.
You couldn't put steam engines behind one another without having a crew in each and every single steam engine. So if you made the engines bigger, you could save on crew cost. One crew, on the other hand, you see, could handle a much larger train the bigger an engine they were given. So labor cost was driving this whole equation of bigger locomotives.
One by one, locomotive manufacturers began to build larger engines. The first giants were simply expanded versions of their 8-wheeled cousins. Big locomotives like the 282 Mikados took on the tough task of pulling heavy trains solo. The increased power and speed pleased railroad owners, and operating a giant became one of the top assignments on the rails.
That profession back in the steam age was a profession based not just on seniority but on merit, and you didn't give these big engines to anything less than what we'd call them the fighter pilots of their age. That was the quality of skill. The individual arts of handling the throttle and the brakes really had to be done with very special skill.
Being the engineer or fireman aboard a steam giant may have seemed like glamorous work to the train-riding public, but in reality, it was a dirty, difficult, and dangerous job. Arthur Swan Jr. worked on the railroad for 35 years. Much of his time was spent in the locomotive cabs of the Norfolk and Western Railway, which operated some of the greatest steam giants.
The engines would shake and rock, and stuff would fall down from underneath the cowling, and cinders would come down on top of the boiler head. You couldn't hear yourself think, or when you blew the whistle, you couldn't hear yourself talk. People don't realize how dirty it is, but it's a life that's well spent.
Operating the big engines brought prestige to the men who sat at their controls. In the early days of the steam giants, locomotive crews were king.
These guys had a swagger in their step, and they knew what they were about. And I like to say these gentlemen held the presidents of the railroad in their glove, because of all the unions, the ones that were most respected by management were the ones of those that ran the locomotives and ran the trains, the engineers, the firemen, conductors, brakemen, because you didn't replace those gentlemen overnight.
When an average steam locomotive chugged into town, it always drew attention. When a giant arrived, it demanded to be noticed. There was no escaping the deafening roar. The air filled with billowing clouds of steam, and the ground trembled under the approaching weight. Compared to their less voracious and smaller counterparts, the early giants would often consume double the amount of fuel and water. Their arrival in any town was an awe-inspiring sight.
They were just tremendous achievements. They were literally the high tech of their day.
Hank Kinzel was a fireman on the Norfolk and Western. His experience as a child watching giants roll past his home left an indelible memory that influenced his decision to work on the rails.
My father was a railroader, and consequently I was raised as a railroad child, kind of like an army brat. And we lived in the coal fields next to the railroad tracks. There was no other place to live, either on the riverbank or the railroad tracks. And I watched the Norfolk and Western freight trains, the big engines in those days. Consequently, when I was old enough to go out on my own, I tried several things, but railroading was too much in the blood, and I had to get with it.
Steam giants changed the face of American railroading, but the race to build the biggest engines was just beginning. The need for more power was soon equaled by the desire for more speed, and the limits of the steam locomotive were about to be stretched beyond what anyone had ever dreamed possible. As the nation continued its unbridled growth into the 20th century, the demands on the railroads to transport people and freight increased dramatically. In response, locomotives pulled longer and heavier trains. Steam giants grew larger and more powerful as railroads sought the most economical ways to move the heavy loads. 8 driving wheels soon gave way to 10. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe became as well known for the Judy Garland song from the movie The Harvey Girls as it was for the railroad's success. In 1903, it was the first to use the 2-10-2 wheel arrangement, named the Santa Fe type in its honor. More wheels working together meant greater pulling power. The locomotive's rigid underframe grew longer to accommodate extra driving wheels. But this created a problem getting around sharp curves. In Europe, a Frenchman named Anatole Mallet engineered a solution. Mallet was an industrious young man with a degree from Paris's prestigious École Centrale School of Art and Manufacturing. Shortly after graduating in 1858, he joined forces with fellow schoolmate and noted structural engineer Gustave Eiffel. Together, they built a great railway bridge in the Bordeaux region of France. The successful completion of the bridge served as Mallet's introduction to railroading. Some 30 years later, in 1889, when Eiffel's Tower in Paris was dedicated, Mallet solved the problem of the rigid frame. He hinged locomotives, or articulated the frame in the middle. He placed driving wheels and cylinders on each half. This allowed the two halves to work independently.
It was actually 2 engines under one boiler, under control of one engineer. Nothing existed at the time that could take tonnage up mountains better than the Mallet locomotive.
Mallet's locomotive offered another practical feature. It used steam twice. It channeled the exhaust steam from the rear cylinders to power the front ones. The process, called compounding, was more efficient and saved the railroads tons of fuel and water. The Mallet design allowed the development of powerful giants with 2 sets of driving wheels, which could do the work of 2 conventional locomotives. Railroad executives welcomed the technology to America in 1904, but laborers concerned about keeping their jobs were not enthusiastic.
These locomotives in some areas were resisted by the crews because the crews were being replaced 2 for 1. There are stories of crews not running them to their capacity just as a protest.
Another concern crews had about these locomotives had to do with their health. The problem was smoke. The cab where the engineer and the fireman ran the train was typically at the rear of the locomotive. Big locomotives produced so much exhaust that tunnels would fill with thick soot as the engine passed through. California's Southern Pacific lines traversed the steep Sierra Nevada mountains and had many tunnels. In 1910, the railroad purchased a unique Mallet-type locomotive with the cruise cab mounted on the front of the engine.
And the reason for the cab placement in front was the engine could operate without asphyxiating the crew in the tunnels, in the snow sheds up the high ridge of the Donner Pass in the Southern Pacific. Otherwise, in those snow sheds, the crews simply would have been overcome by the fumes. There was another railroad called the Western Pacific, and its locomotives were not the cabin front type, but they actually had to issue gas masks to the crew to be able to get through the tunnel. The Southern Pacific crews, on the other hand, appreciated those cab forwards because they didn't have that problem in their environment.
Railroaders were a hardy breed, but they didn't take to riding on the vulnerable front end of a locomotive.
After they overcame an initial resistance to riding out on the extreme front of a locomotive, just really loved them. These became world famous, and they were unique to the Southern Pacific. No other railroad found their use necessary, but they were a godsend for the Southern Pacific's mountain operations.
Mallet locomotives, like the Southern Pacific's early cab forwards, were powerful and efficient, but very slow. Engine designers sought better solutions for the next 40 years. A quiet man named Will Woodard was one of them. Woodard was born in Utica, New York in 1873, 4 years after the completion of America's celebrated Transcontinental Railroad. He graduated from Cornell University in 1896 with a degree in mechanical engineering and went on to work for the country's two largest steam builders. First the Baldwin Locomotive Works, and then the American Locomotive Company, ALCO. Woodard's solid reputation caught the attention of a small steam engine manufacturer in Ohio. Lima Locomotive Works saw itself as a giant killer. It had two things to sell: superior design and excellent workmanship. Lima lured Woodard away from the big companies by offering him the position of Vice President of Engineering. He accepted, and in 1916 set out to turn the little guys of steam into the scientists of steam.
Yes, I knew him. He was in the drawing office frequently. I was down in the lower ranks at the time, but he would berate me a little bit sometimes when he didn't like the design that I was working on. He had the ability to draw different devices and different planning and thoughts together. I think that's probably his greatest ability.
In 1922, Woodard developed a new approach to producing cost-effective steam power, one that offered more speed at higher horsepower. His superpower concept worked by burning fuel in a larger fuel box to make more steam. The new locomotive was easily recognizable. 4 trailing wheels were required under the cab instead of 2 to help carry the extra weight.
Well, Lima had the superpower engine and had a very good spirit of the corps in the engineering department, and was not afraid to risk a few things. They were forward-looking, and Lima, I think, took a very deep interest in giving the customer a locomotive that would perform.
Woodard's new locomotive increased horsepower by up to 25% and increased speed without significantly increasing operating costs, and railroad managers loved it. Lima vigorously marketed its superpower concept, making it one of the most universally accepted breakthroughs of the giant steam engine era. During his career, Will Woodard was granted over 100 patents for various railroad devices. When he died at age 68, he had risen to the rank of Vice President of Design and a Director of Lima. More importantly, the soft-spoken genius had earned the respect of an entire industry. By 1930, steam was a 200-year-old energy source. but 20th century ingenuity had turned it into the world's most productive tool. The railroad steam giants were the culmination of 2 centuries of advancement.
These were engines of 70, 80, 90 feet long, well over 100, 120 feet with the tenders, and just unheard of in size. They were just tremendous achievements.
Railroads made their money hauling freight and their reputations hauling passengers. By 1930, one of the most popular high-speed giants pulling passenger trains was the 484 Northern type, a superpower locomotive. Coal-burning Northerns consumed enough fuel in an hour to heat a 2-story house through the winter. Their billowing exhaust plume was easy to spot.
Well, the big Northerns, what made it real different was the fact that it was a high-speed engine. Of course, when he got on a 800 with a passenger train, he went like a streak, which was great.
Northerns were beautiful locomotives to watch. They whisked passengers across the rivers and prairies of America's heartland. But more challenges lay ahead for the steam giants. Endless tons of freight needed to be hauled over the nation's highest mountains. It seemed even the giants were about to reach their limit. They rise toward the sky with names befitting their majesty. The Wasatch, Blue Ridge, and Allegheny. Mountain ranges form some of the most difficult obstacles that America's railroads had to overcome. Conquering the mountains was why the largest and best-known steam giants were built. Steep grades, sharp curves, and inclement weather challenged a railroad's timetable, manpower, and ultimately its bottom line. A railroad manager based his operating strategies on the type of cargo he had to move. Coal and ore trains would literally crawl. Merchandise trains or fast freights had to move more quickly, and passenger trains had to fly. Schedules had to be met, and so did strict government and union labor regulations. Mountain districts often required multiple engines to handle a single train, and each locomotive pulling or pushing a train still had to carry a crew of 2 men. Operating one locomotive that could do the work of 2 cut labor costs in half. Owning the largest custom-built locomotives may have given a railroad's brass bragging rights, but more importantly, running the steam giants made economic sense.
One of the great things about the steam era was the fact that each railroad had its own. There was very little standardization. It was very difficult for one engine, custom built for one railroad, to be entirely satisfactory on another railroad. But getting the people who had to use it on the other railroad to accept it would be something else.
The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway was one company insistent on having its own way when it came to locomotive design. The C&O stretched from Chesapeake Bay in Virginia to the Ohio Valley and beyond. It was known as George Washington's Railroad because America's founding father also helped found a network of roads and canals which the C&O Railroad eventually replaced. In the Appalachian Mountains, the coal industry provided thousands of families with jobs. Transporting coal was the major revenue item on the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. Efficiently moving it from the mines to the market was a priority. The C&O had an adequate roster of locomotives in coal train service. But in 1940, they wanted bigger and better. Lima Locomotive Works was willing to build one based on an unconventional design first developed in 1928.
Lima proposed a 212-6 locomotive. Its designer, Will Woodard, projected this as an improvement or an expansion of locomotives of the 210-4 wheel arrangement then in use.
The design failed, but it served as the inspiration for a mammoth articulated locomotive. That locomotive was the 2666 Allegheny type. It stood over 16.5 feet tall. It was over 125.5 feet long. It weighed 778,000 pounds and recorded the highest horsepower rating of any piston-driven steam locomotive, nearly 7,500 horsepower.
There was a committee of engineers that were put together by the Chesapeake and Ohio and other associated railroads. And this committee knew that steam was dying. There'd be one last chance to set a world's record in terms of power. This committee set out that what they were going to accomplish was design the most horsepowerful locomotive they could to beat anything in sight in terms of horsepower and speed. And they succeeded.
The Allegheny was a powerful and beautiful locomotive, but it created as much controversy as it did smoke.
It stands today as one of the ultimate steam locomotives ever built, but for the railroad to put it to work hauling coal over its mountain at 18 miles an hour was a tremendous waste of performance. The locomotive capabilities were not being used in that service. The C&O, in my opinion, never really had a job that locomotive could do.
To make matters worse, it was discovered that Lima had misrepresented the weight of the first Alleghenies. Train crews were paid by the locomotive's weight on its driving wheels. Alleghenies were found to be thousands of pounds heavier than first claimed. Engineers and firemen saw the miscalculation as an attack on their livelihood. In 1944, the C&O sued Lima. The railroad had been forced to pay thousands of dollars in crew back pay. Lima reportedly paid out more than $3 million in losing the suit, not to mention their lost pride. The company's largest locomotive had become a bust. Locomotives like the Alleghenies muscled coal trains through the mountains of the east. In the western states, another breed of steam giant was powering through the mountains and canyons of Wyoming and Utah. The Omaha-based Union Pacific Railroad built the eastern half of the Transcontinental Railroad and is the only major American line that has never changed its name. The Union Pacific has always loved big engines, and in 1936 bought 40 4664 Challenger-type locomotives from Alco. Simple articulated locomotives like Challengers used steam directly from the boiler to operate all 4 cylinders. They were costlier, but the locomotives were much faster than the Mallet compound engines. During World War II, the Union Pacific asked Alco to expand the engine's design by adding 2 additional pairs of driving wheels. Alco obliged. The locomotives were built in the company's premier Schenectady works in New York. One day, an Alco worker wrote "Big Boy" on the smoke box of one of the engines. The name stuck. The UP took delivery of 25 4884 Big Boys from 1941 to 1944 and officially referred to them as the 4000 class. It was the only railroad to operate the monsters.
The engines were getting up to the absolute limit in dimensions and in weight particularly. On the Union Pacific, in order to run the Big Boys, they actually had to straighten out some curves. They had to remove some restrictions and bridges and tunnels. They actually had to separate double track that was adjacent so the engines wouldn't hit each other on curves.
Big Boys rightfully deserved their name. They stood over 16 feet tall. They were 132 feet long and weighed 772,000 pounds. They reportedly could pull a train 5 miles long on flat terrain. Big Boys were the biggest things on Western rails, and they could intimidate anyone, especially a kid on his first railroad job.
I was right out of high school at the time, and this was about the largest, most huge piece of equipment I'd ever seen. In a huge firebox, 20-some-odd feet long, and of course my duties were principally in front of that firebox. And I recall one time that I was checking my firebox like that when the engineer decided to increase the power, and the draft sucked the shovel right out of my hand, and I didn't have a shovel to use the rest of that trip. It was in the firebox and of course immediately melted with all of the heat that was in there. It was quite an experience for a youngster.
Big Boy was my love of the steam locomotives. It was just kind of like music. You hear that exhaust coming from the stack. We used to say that 4,000, when you're going uphill with it, it'd say, come along, come along, come along, come along. And you felt like you had muscle under you when you was on that 4,000.
Unlike Alleghenies, which were frequently used in slow-speed coal service, Big Boys whisked high-speed freight over tough grades. This allowed them to reach their peak horsepower more often in the 40-mile-an-hour range.
The thing about the Big Boy was that it was designed for high-speed, heavy freight service, and that's the way it was used. We had a locomotive that we said could pull 100 cars up the Wasatch, and it did, repeatedly every day. In overall terms, in terms of its physical size, its weight, its appearance, and its performance, nobody beat it.
The Big Boys and Alleghenies have both been called the largest steam locomotives ever built, and both have legions of fans.
Part of the allure of the Big Boy is the fact that it had 16 driving wheels and all these leading and trailing wheels, and that the whole package was put together in such an attractive manner. It was good and it looked good. There are people that say the Big Boy was better than the Allegheny, but they never ran in comparable service and never competed against each other, so this is another thing that we'll never know. But it is an interesting issue to contemplate.
By the 1950s, clean and economical diesels were replacing steam locomotives on the rails. Despite the landmark refinements of Anatole Mallet and Will Woodard, the days of the giants were growing short. But one railroad refused to put the fires out in the bellies of its steam locomotives. It was on this line that the giants made their last great stand. American steam locomotives had been fueled by wood, oil, and coal in their 125-year existence. But by 1955, most rail lines could turn a greater profit by scrapping steam giants and replacing them with modern diesel locomotives. Virginia's Norfolk and Western Railway thought differently. N&W territory stretched from Norfolk, Virginia to Cincinnati, Ohio, and traversed some of the richest coal mining country in America. Getting that coal to market was a priority for the Norfolk and Western. This railroad, more than any other, refined the use of coal-powered steam in its engines.
The magic of the Norfolk and Western really was a dedicated company policy to building efficient locomotives. They were designed by N&W personnel, and they were built right in Roanoke shops to their own designs and specifications and tailored to the particular operating conditions of the Norfolk and Western. They defined a modern steam locomotive as one that could operate with a minimum of maintenance and a high degree of availability.
The N&W operated slow-speed coal drags, high-speed freight trains, and swift passenger service. It perfected one type of engine for each specific duty.
As far as I'm concerned, the Norfolk and Western has built 3 of the best locomotives in the world. They're all simplified and powerful locomotives. They will haul and they will run and they'll do almost anything you want them to do. Economical too. We had hills and we had mountains, but we could run.
The railroad's premier heavy tonnage hauler was the 2882Y class locomotive. This basic Mallet type was originally conceived by the N&W and then adopted by the United States Railroad Administration. The USRA was formed during World War I to regulate and improve performance on America's railroads. It championed 12 modern locomotive designs to aid the war effort. The 2882 was one design that the N&W borrowed back and improved on for 35 years.
The Norfolk Western had steep hills, heavy tonnage, and sharp curvature. They wanted a locomotive that would be comfortable hauling tonnage up mountains from 15 to 25 miles an hour. They refined their 2882s over the years until they came up with a locomotive that had the perfect characteristics for what they needed, getting all the horsepower that the locomotive was capable of producing. What the Norfolk Western wound up with was a locomotive that could produce the power of a big boy at 25 miles an hour, but do it by using steam twice.
The Norfolk and Western took a locomotive 20% lighter than a big boy and gave it nearly 30% greater starting power. At 25 miles an hour, both locomotives had equal horsepower. The N&W excelled at doing more with less. When it came to moving fast freight or large passenger trains over mountains, the N&W triumphed with another innovative locomotive design, the A-Class.
These were 2664 locomotives, not a common wheel arrangement. And at the time they were built, there was nothing on rails that was comparable. These locomotives produced a transportation record that probably is as good as any steam locomotive ever built. They wound up hauling trains of 16,000 tons of coal from Williamson, West Virginia to Portsmouth, Ohio, in less than 4 hours running time. This is 112 miles under full throttle operation on a tender full of coal. I don't know that a big boy could have done it. I don't think the Allegheny could have done it. And I don't know what else would be capable of it.
The Norfolk and Western perfected a third type of locomotive in their famed Roanoke shops. A 4/8/4 wheel arrangement was commonly referred to as a northern type, but in the heart of Virginia, these Southerners preferred to call their locomotive the J.
There were only 14 J's, but they were really the crown jewel of the N&W insofar as passenger power was concerned. And although taste is a matter of personal choice, a lot of people think they were the most tastefully streamlined locomotive ever built. They had an aerodynamic look about them, and yet they retained the essential dynamic elements of the steam locomotive. And the one feature that was particularly significant about them was the lightweight reciprocating parts. And that was one of the secrets of their ability to be able to operate at high speed, although they were primarily a mountain engine.
A J's machinery was so well designed and its balance so precise that two people could reportedly push it on level track. It was another source of pride on a railroad fired by prideful achievement and coal.
That was a feeling which went throughout the Norfolk and Western system. The pride in their locomotives, which were designed by their own people, built in their own shops, and built for a particular purpose. The Norfolk and Western stuck with the steam locomotive longer than any other major railroad in the country, and was the last major road to dieselize. They gave steam its best effort and most success in the last 25 years of operation.
People loved the Norfolk and Western. All the employees, you never found a sawhead, never one of them. They all loved their jobs, and they loved the railroads, and they treated the railroad as their own personal property.
Commercial photographer O. Winston Link loved the Norfolk and Western steam giants. He began his career in New York and eventually combined his photography with a childhood fascination with trains. Link's one-of-a-kind snapshots of steam trains are renowned in both the railroad and art worlds. The coming of the diesel era in the 1950s prompted him to document the twilight years of the N&W steam giants.
I was seeing headlines in magazines and newspapers that one railroad after another had lost steam, so I decided I had to do something. I was being forced into it. And Norfolk and Western was the only one left that's 100% steam. When I started work in 1955, I had 450 steam engines to work with of all different classes. It was paradise for a photographer, for anyone that loves steam engines. There's just nothing you could ask for them better than that.
Link excelled in the art of night photography. He used massive banks of flash bulbs to capture stunning, eerie, and sometimes bizarre images of people and trains. He witnessed the end of an era, men working with their giant machines for the last time.
Everybody liked the railroad and they all depended on it. They loved it. They went out right outside their house, just with a few feet of their living room. They didn't care. They loved all the engineers. They knew all the crew. They knew everybody on it. Steam engines held the place together, and everybody loved them, and they loved the railroad. I regret that I wasn't able to spend more time in the locomotive shop, where you see the machinery that was used to make a locomotive. The other thing that I would like to have done would have worked with the mechanical engineers that did the design work on a lot of the work that went into these steam engines, because they were geniuses.
After years of stoking the flames of coal-fired steam, even the Norfolk and Western was forced to concede to the economic superiority of diesel locomotives. In 1960, the railroad stopped running the last regularly scheduled steam train in America.
It's probably an ironic bit of history that some of the last duty performed by these huge locomotives very often was pulling coal, the very fuel that they burned. There's a line from Shakespeare, I think, which sums it up pretty well, and that is a line about being consumed by that which it was nourished by. And very literally, the steam locomotive was doing just that.
Steam engines vanished and took with them the livelihoods of the men and women who built and ran them. Dealing with this loss would be the railroaders' greatest challenge. Steam giants represented the pinnacle of an evolutionary process that began in 1803, the year English inventor Richard Trevithick built the first steam-powered locomotive to run on rails. Diesel engines changed the rules 150 years later. Unlike hand-built, labor-intensive, and water-gulping steam giants, diesels were mass-produced, economical, and only needed enough water for their crews to drink. By 1960, the diesel's versatility and cost-effectiveness had put steam engines out of business on all major American railroads. Hundreds of jobs were lost. Foundrymen, pipe fitters, and boilermakers suddenly had nothing left to build or repair.
It was hard on a lot of people. You take somebody that had started out as an apprentice boy, an apprentice boilermaker, had honed his skills during his apprenticeship, which would be 3 to 5 years, and had then become a boilermaker and had worked nights and had worked weekends and had endured furloughs and layoffs and things like that, and worked his way up pretty close to the top of the seniority roster, and then one day he's laid off for good because the boilers are gone, so they don't need him anymore. Sociologically, that had to be terrible.
I was a pipe fitter, and there was about 10 miles of pipe on those big locomotives, and every time I'd cut the branch pipes off and steam pipes, the injectors and the water pumps, and oh, this is a shame. Cut them up, cut all that stuff up. And we worked on them for years, you know, and they made our living for us. And we just hated to see it happen.
Engineers and firemen were luckier than back shop employees. They still had jobs. Crews were trained to operate the new locomotives, though it wasn't the same.
When the diesels started to come, I had a regular job of firing, and I thought I'd never be cut off. And the diesels took my job away from me for several years. The first diesels were just something that you really didn't want around.
People that made these steam locomotives go were a different breed of animal than the people that make diesels go. It's a characteristic of the machine. The diesel locomotive is like an automobile. If you floorboard an automobile, you're going to automatically get all the power that the engine can give you. If you put a diesel locomotive in full throttle, you're going to get all the power that that diesel can give you. But it wasn't necessarily so with a steam locomotive. A fellow that was going to get the most out of a steam locomotive had to have a feel for the machine and had to have an ear for the way the machine was responding through its exhaust. He had to literally be more of an engineer than a fellow did with the diesel.
Running a steam giant was an art form on the verge of oblivion. Only railroaders born prior to World War II knew the intricacies of operating one. Vernon L. Smith began working around locomotives at a Minnesota iron mine in 1928 when he was 16. His career in railroading spanned 50 years. Among his proudest achievements was being a design engineer. He literally gave life to steam giants.
The locomotive that I felt very strongly to was 3752, which was rebuilt on the Santa Fe and what can be considered the last steam locomotive built on the system. I was given the job to do all the engineering. She was finished on February 4th, 1948, a bitterly cold day. We weighed the engine and we took her out to the engine house, and she was fired up. And my wife came out with the two boys to see the engine, Dad's engine. And I felt very strongly about it.
Smith shared his experiences in a book about his life's work entitled One Man's Locomotives. On the cover is a picture of his Santa Fe steam giant number 3752. It was painted by a man who was touched by Vernon's passion for crafting excellence, his son. It was hard to feel indifferent towards a steam giant. Its clamor and belching smoke infuriated those with laundry drying on the line or someone in a deep sleep. But for countless others, the engineer's long whistle and the train's thundering roar were mesmerizing. They made the heart race. Rumbling steam giants conjured up worlds of wonder to rail fans, historians, and daydreamers.
Any railroad was identifiable by its power, more than it was by its day coaches or its signals or anything else. It is not the same since diesels. All the diesels may be painted differently, but underneath the paint, there's not that much difference between them. Not to us old diehards, there isn't.
Today, small steam engines delight children in parks and vacationers on tourist lines. They give retired railroad men and women a chance to relive their days of glory. Only a handful of privately restored 484 steam giants remain. They'll occasionally pull a summer excursion train or make a guest appearance in a Hollywood film. A few years ago, a Norfolk and Western A-Class and a Union Pacific Challenger were restored and put into use in excursion service. But maintaining these giants is an expensive proposition. Both now sit in heated engine houses as their owners ponder what to do with the two largest operational relics of steam's golden age. Many railroads donated numbers of their steam giants to municipal parks and museums. But most giants fell to the scrapyard cutting torch. $200,000 locomotives were sold in chunks for pennies a pound. At the time, it signified progress. But in the tear-filled eyes of those who loved the giants, it was the end of an era and a way of life. Their fires were dropped decades ago, But the memories of their golden age live on. Future generations can look at what remains of these super locomotives and realize that not so long ago, railroads were a domain prowled by steaming giants.